Harold James from Princeton University, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Governor Holzmann. The paper that I prepared for you was really a discussion of the long-term perspective on European integration, and particularly what lessons could be learned from the history of Europe's successful integration project. The story of European integration and the story of globalization go hand in hand with each other. Often critics, when they turn against globalization, also turn against the European Union. And on the other hand, people who want to express the support for the desirability of the integration process will tell you that the European process and Europeanizing decisions and policy processes is the best way of handling globalization, is producing responses to globalization on the trade front, but also on the front of monetary order. And in the 1970s, the early 1980s, when it was the question of discussing European monetary integration, one of the powerful forces that was driving the process then was the feeling that the dollar-centered world, as it was created in 1945, is now coming to an end. That was a premature thought. We're still in a really fundamentally dollar-centered world. But I think it's exactly right at this moment to flag that question as well. There were some other aspects that I wanted to take up briefly. Globalization processes have always produced questions and crises, and some of those responses to crises have been productive, and some of them have not been productive. What makes for a successful response to a crisis? I think that's a question that everybody is asking themselves in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. In the 1930s, the collapse of globalization with the Great Depression was something that clearly made the world more unstable and demanded a reordering of the world in the aftermath of World War II. And that's what produced the international institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, but it's also what fundamentally produced the process of European integration. In the 1970s, the oil price shock again led to a questioning, widespread questioning of whether democracies were capable of dealing with these kind of problems, whether the international economic order was unjust or not, what needed to be done. And the crisis in the end produced a substantial liberalization and an enormous expansion of trade. In the 1990s, the discussion of what happens after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, what happens with Central and Eastern Europe, also leads to a very, very productive rethinking. And the response finally to the global financial crisis after 2008 produced a really painful and divisive experience in Europe, in which the North was set against the South, and then increasingly the West was set against the East. And people really started to doubt the coherence and the sustainability of the European project. And so in the light of that, I wonder whether we can think of some lessons. One lesson, I think, that I would like to point out, and it's more fully worked out in the paper than it is in the space that I can have now, is that the old European method of thinking that any crisis is good because it forces automatically further integration is not adequate. It's not adequate unless you explain very carefully why and for what reasons this new integration is desirable. Another lesson, I think, is that the fact of a big supply shock is going to have a very, very substantial impact. And we should think, if we compare the COVID crisis with previous interruptions of globalization, that it's not like many of them. In many cases, it's a very difficult question to work out what had caused the problem. People are still debating intensively about the causes of the Great Depression. People are still not certain about the causes of the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. But this, like the oil price shock in the 1970s, is basically very simple. That governments deliberately shut down their economies in order to prevent the health systems from being overburdened. And so the action was really intended, but it's producing a long series of consequences, some of which are already apparent, some of which are not yet apparent. And in particular, supply shocks like this will cause long-standing differences in terms of the adjustment of the relative prices. So when we're thinking, and it's clearly the task that all of you are thinking about how to formulate monetary policy, the central indicator, the price indicator, is very unstable, because we can't think in the aftermath of the crisis in the same way about a general basket of consumer goods, because the prices in the basket are going to swing very, very radically. And so we may see a immediate deflationary impact, that's very evident, but we also may see, in the way in which supply chains are having to be readjusted, in the way in which savings are building up in some sectors of the economy and the demand is pent up, we may also see a whiplash effect in terms of a rebound of inflation. So the uncertainty is enormous. One other feature of supply shocks, which I think we would do well to think about, is that supply shocks really call into question the competence of governments. And you will see everywhere throughout the world people making judgments about the cohesiveness, the coherence of governments' responses. Some governments are doing very well in the face of the corona crisis. You can look to models. If you think of models outside Europe, you can think of Korea, South Korea, or Japan, or New Zealand. You can think of other countries that are doing very poorly in comparison. Brazil, I'm afraid to say my own country, the United States, my former country, the United Kingdom, are not doing well. And so this is a moment, I think, when those questions that Governor Holzmann raised about the coherence of policy and the testing of policy and benchmarking of good policy responses becomes more and more crucial. And finally, this is a big challenge for Europe. In the course of the summer, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel made this joint statement, very bold terms about the obsolescence of the nation state in Europe. People have said that many times before, but in some ways it looks more real now. It looks more real because the question of organizing supply chains properly so that people all over Europe have access to medical resources, to medical supplies, is vital. But also it is crucial to get the fiscal policy response right, to get the monetary policy response right. And this looks at last as if it's the moment. People are now talking about a Hamiltonian moment when there's a very radically new approach to fiscal management. Does it look like the moment in the history of the United States in the early years of the Republic when Alexander Hamilton mutualized the debt of the state? You're not talking about mutualizing debt, but you are thinking now of a common fiscal expenditure and a revenue stream that will finance that. And when you're thinking about that, I think it is important to keep in mind the problems that Hamilton had. Setting up the revenue stream is going to be really difficult. You will really need to think very, very clearly about whether the kind of revenue that you have to service the new European bonds is going to be in coherence with long-term objectives. And it is easy to think of ways in doing that. One suggestion, for instance, is to base the revenue stream on the management of the response to carbon trading and on the sale of carbon certificates. So that would be, I think, a way in which you could have a productive learning of crisis that fits in to longer-term objectives. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harold James. You raised a very challenging question in the last one, just on what is the appropriate revenue stream for paying back the bonds. It's something I raised 2 weeks ago in Brussels to the policymakers there, and my understanding is for the time being, the answer has not yet been well developed. So thanks again for raising it as well.